And so for the Spanish speakers, they can go and get an equipment here. And whenever there is a Spanish speaker talking, we will do consecutive interpretation. So the English speakers do not need an equipment. Mónica, please.
Hola, buenos días, bienvenidos. En este evento vamos a hablar en inglés. Por lo tanto, le pedimos a los hispanoparlantes que por favor agarren un equipo para que puedan escuchar la interpretación al español, y siempre cuando un hispanoparlante quiere contribuir, va a haber interpretación consecutiva para que todos puedan entender. Muchas gracias.
Great. So, let's start. Let's just see here. Hello? Is that okay? Yeah? Good? Just give us a second, everyone. Now it sounds better. Hello? Hello? It could be mine. Hmm? Yeah. Hello? Yeah. Does anyone have the SB56 platform open? No? Is it okay now? What, do you know, was it my laptop here? It was there. Brilliant. Good. Okay. Good. So, let's start. And apologies for this minor issue. Great. So, today's event, at today's event, we will assess if and to what extent Indigenous peoples, their rights and their knowledge systems are becoming recognized in climate governance, both at global level, at national level, and at local subnational level. And we'll take point of departure in, let's see, which laptop? Yeah, in these two publications, which have been co-produced by the Inuit Circumpolar Council, Pastoralist NGO Forum, and Nepal Federation of Indigenous Nationalities, and then as well of the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs, IWGIA. And these two briefing papers assess how the IPCC in their two most recent reports recognize Indigenous peoples and their rights and knowledge systems, both with regards to their report from March on impact, adaptation, vulnerability, and also in their most recent report on mitigation. And this last one here is brand new and being launched today at this event. And it has been a great honor to work with Deli Sambo, Joanna Petrasek McDonald, Tunga Badrarai, Gideon Sanago, and Rosario Carmona on these publications, and especially with regards to coming up with recommendations to the two states and to the IPCC, which we'll go through today. And so the event here will take point of departure in these recommendations for a broader discussion on recognition of Indigenous peoples in climate governance in general. So we have an inspiring panel of speakers. We have Gideon Sanago, who is climate coordinator at the Pastoralist Indigenous People, Pastoralist NGO Forum of Tanzania. And we have Milagros. Bienvenida. Welcome very much. And feel free to take a seat. I'm just introducing the panel. Milagros Sandoval Diaz, Director General of Climate Change and Desertification at the Ministry of Environment in Peru. And then we have Melania Poma Canales, Bien. President of the National Organization of Andean and Amazonian Women of Peru, ONAMIAP. And I can't even see my colleagues here, but we have Lisa down there, sorry, Lisa, you have to help me. Vice President of the Canadian branch of the Inuit Circumpolar Council. And last but not the least, we have Emily Valley-Watt, who is Senior Policy Analyst at the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change in Canada. And I didn't introduce you, Rosario Carmona, anthropologist and collaborating partner with IWGIA. Rosario, you have also been a contributing author to the Working Group 1, the IPCC Working Group 1 paper, which is not, or report, which is not included in these, but you have a bit of knowledge of the process through that experience. Yes, great. So let's start then by taking a bit of a closer look of what the IPCC, what we have found that the IPCC recommends with regards to Indigenous peoples. And Rosario, if you could give us some of the key takeaways that we have identified in our reports. Thank you very much.
Hi. Yeah. Hi everyone. Muy buenos días a todas y todos. As Stefan was mentioning, we observe huge improvements in the consideration of indigenous peoples and their knowledge systems in the last cycle of the IPCC report, especially in Working Group 2. The IPCC has included more indigenous authors and also for the first time has invited an indigenous organization to be an official observer of the process, which is the Inuit Circumpolar Council. The Working Group 2 explicitly recognizes the value of indigenous people's knowledge. The Working Group 2 also gives more attention to specific impacts affecting indigenous territories and recognizes the link between past and ongoing colonial practices that marginalize indigenous peoples and make them vulnerable to climate change, which we consider as a huge step in, for the first time, naming colonization as a huge factor for climate vulnerability. Both Working Group 2 and 3 agree that indigenous peoples are also highly affected by top-down approaches to climate action and that maladaptation and many mitigation practices reinforce marginalization and the violation of indigenous peoples' rights. Despite this high vulnerability, the Working Group 2 acknowledges indigenous peoples and their knowledge and mentions that are crucial to effective and sustainable climate action. Among others, the IPCC recognized the significant contributions of indigenous peoples to forest governance, biodiversity, and ecosystem conservation. Regarding indigenous knowledge, the Working Group 2 and Working Group 3 mentioned that indigenous people's knowledge is crucial for the resilience of social ecological systems. Also, it is fundamental to risk reduction, impact assessment, disaster preparedness, and resilience. All these capacities are entangled with improved life quality, human well-being, and sustainable development. Furthermore, according to Working Group 2, the involvement of indigenous peoples is a precondition for achieving sustainable food and water systems. Because all these attributes, the integration of indigenous people's knowledge into climate action enhance the effectiveness of local adaptation and land-based mitigation measures. But the role of indigenous peoples goes beyond the local level, and the IPCC highlights the role of indigenous people's movements and indigenous people's knowledge in promoting climate action and climate justice worldwide. Also, the report states that indigenous peoples contribute to promote transformative change by providing new narratives and understanding of climate change that lead to alternative and more integrated responses. So yes, we can observe a huge step in the life cycle in the recognition of indigenous peoples.
Thank you very much, Rosario, and we'll come back to you later to talk about, again, while we do see huge steps forward, we also see some gaps and shortcomings, but we'll wait for that until later. So now let's turn towards our other panelists who can kind of help us to assess and see to what degree these messages of the IPCC translates to action at regional, national and local level, and also some of the challenges in that regard. And so the first question to each of our panelists is, like, from your experience, how are Indigenous peoples recognized in climate governance in where you're from, in your region, in your government, in your country, or territory? And it would be very good if we could kind of keep the format as brief intervention and in dialogue format. So indeed we come up with foster a good dialogue for inspiration and ideas. And so Gideon, let's start with you. COP27 will be in Africa, but how do you think, or how do you feel that Indigenous peoples in Africa, and more specifically where you're from in Tanzania, are recognized by the governments in climate governance? And perhaps maybe you could also briefly tell us about the recently established knowledge holder platform that I know you are involved in Tanzania. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefan and IGIA and other partners who organize these side events, and we appreciate to be part of the panel speakers. With regards to your questions about the COP27 that will be held in Egypt, in Africa, I am currently a co-chair of the African caucus for the next COP27. So recently we had a Zoom meeting with African colleague, indigenous organizations in Africa, held in March, and we were discussing on how we organize ourselves towards the COP27 that will be held in our soil in Africa, and how we organize the communities to effectively participate to this COP27 in Africa. But also recently, again in May, we had another CSOs meeting in person from not only indigenous organization, but the CSOs across Africa. We had another meeting, preparatory meetings on how again we organize ourselves as CSOs, as indigenous people, as communities, to make sure that we set our own priorities and come up with key messages, as well as develops the key priorities that we think it is of paramount, it is of importance for the African communities as far as indigenous people are concerned, to be given priority in the next COP that's I have already mentioned to be held in Africa. So we have come up with the position papers, as I said, key message developments, as well as the country position paper and the continents, African indigenous people continents, to come up with a position paper that will highlight key issues that is really needed for us towards COP27. This is also, we would like to see that to ensure indigenous people voices from the grounds are heard. That is one of the very, very important things. But also we have discussed about the logistical issues, including the accommodation. It seems like the accommodation in Egypt is quite a difficult issue, is a challenge. So we are trying to make sure that we, and even I encourage you to make sure that you try to book, hotels or apartments, because it seems like it is quite a challenge. We are also using every space and venue available to organize ourselves and communities on the upcoming COP27 in our continent, So we are trying to ensure that every space available, every venue available, we use it to ensure that we will effectively participate as Indigenous people and to ensure our voices are heard. One of the key important component again is about information and documentation of the best practices and different the best cases to be showcased during the COP27 in Egypt, and to ensure that we display, as well as having a pavilion, Indigenous people pavilion. We are trying to secure the space to ensure that all Indigenous brothers and sisters from a different part of the world will have space to participate in COP. Now we're on the issue related to recognition of our rights from our governments with regard to climate governance. Recently, Tanzania governments have come up with a national climate change strategy responses of 2021, where we participated at Indigenous communities in Tanzania, and we made sure that our references as Indigenous people are found within the strategy. And we as Tanzania, or the government of Tanzania, does not recognize Indigenous people. So they just recognize some groups like pastoralists and hunter-gatherers. So we have managed to have a reference on pastoralist adaptation strategies, how we adapt, but also the issue related to traditional knowledge of Indigenous people in the strategy. Tanzania also is currently on the process for developing the NAPS, National Adaptations Plans. They have just secured funding from the Green Climate Fund to develop the NAPS, supported by UNDP. And we are closely working with the Vice President Office, who is mandated for the environment and climate change, to ensure that Indigenous people will not left out. We have to be part of the development of the NAPS in our country. The other important thing is that you mentioned, Stefan, about the Indigenous people knowledge holders.
Yeah, but perhaps if I just may interrupt you, because maybe, what's happening here? Maybe we can just come back to you in a second round of questions where you can, because there's so much you want to relevant for you to mention. So about the knowledge holder platform, hold on for that, because we'd love to hear that experience. But sorry, I had a keyboard that fell on the floor. But before we come back to you, then let's quickly move on. But thank you so much for also these key insights about COP27, which I think many of us are very interested in knowing also on how you prepare as a regional Indigenous caucus to engage and ensure that this will be a platform to promote Indigenous peoples' rights in a continent where indeed even the term Indigenous peoples are in many countries not recognized. So thank you so much, and we'll come back to you, Gideon. Milagros, thanks for being here. With regards to the recognition of Indigenous peoples in climate governance, could you perhaps reflect a bit on the experience from Peru, especially because I think many of us who have been involved in the local communities and Indigenous peoples platform at international level have heard of the National Indigenous Climate Platform that the government of Peru has established in collaboration and in partnership with Indigenous organizations there, but also feel free to go broader if you want. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First, I would like to thank for the invitation and be able to participate in this event. In the case of Peru, and I think that I can put the perspective of the government, but definitely Melania will also be explaining from the perspective of Indigenous peoples. I think that it's important to understand the process in overall. As the previous speaker mentioned, definitely promoting effective participation is a challenge. And I think it's a challenge that we have to address together, both government, indigenous peoples, civil society, among other stakeholders in countries. This has been addressed definitely at the international level, but now our challenge is at the national levels. And in the case specifically of Peru, I would like to highlight that, first of all, it was indigenous peoples that presented this proposal to the government, and this was addressed in two phases. First, when we were working together with the consultation process to draft the climate change regulation. So we had the climate change law enacted in 2018, and after this we needed to draft together the specific regulation which went through the consultation process established in Convention 169 ILO. So this implied that there was dialogue and discussion related to the specific regulation of the climate change law, and one of the specific issues that was addressed was related to the platform. This was an agreement between the government and indigenous peoples, and the platform was created under the climate change regulations. After this, obviously, the idea is not that we only have the legislation and we stop there. No, the idea was that in 2020, we started to establish the platform, really establish it. But as you all know, COVID came and the pandemic was a challenge. However, we addressed this challenge as well, and we established in 2020 the platform together with indigenous peoples. This platform was constituted with 7 indigenous peoples organizations, the ones that are recognized by the Ministry of Culture. Both the Ministry of Culture and the Ministry of Environment support the platform, but the idea of this platform is to address issues related to indigenous peoples and is part of the governance of climate change in Peru. There are 3 platforms or 3 spaces of governance in Peru. One is the National Commission on Climate Change. The other one is a high-level commission on climate change, where there are governments and ministries that implement the NDC, and the other one is the platform of indigenous people. So there are 3 platforms, and one of these, and there are 3 spaces, and one of these is the platform. It is also important to highlight in this process, obviously, the idea or the objective, the goal of the Indigenous Peoples platform is to bring in the indigenous knowledge and link it, obviously, to what we have recognized and the IPCC has recognized as the importance of what indigenous peoples can bring related to climate change and how they will be and how do they have to address this process as well. So they establish, under the platform, they can establish proposals related to adaptation and mitigation measures, considering their knowledge, practices, and obviously their traditional knowledges. Also, obviously, this, as I mentioned, this is really linked to what we have at the international level, that is Indigenous Peoples Platform and local communities. And what have they been doing since 2020 until now? Well, and probably Melania will reflect on that as well. We have had around 30 meetings. They have already an internal regulation which addresses how they are going to work, and they also have a work plan that establishes 4 specific components. Obviously, this is a learning by doing process. This is the first. Indigenous platform at the national level, as we know. This is the first one that was even created by law. So it is also important I think it's important to highlight that this is something that we need to continue working. Obviously, it implies a lot of support through different organizations and also through international cooperation that has been supporting this process. But definitely the idea, and I think the main takeaway of this process is that how do we institutionalize participation of indigenous peoples and that how they are part of the climate governance of a country. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Milagros, and so interesting to hear of that experience. And maybe we could just then directly move on to Melania, who could maybe take over from there, because and tell us, how has the experience been for the indigenous peoples, the indigenous organizations involved in this process, and especially the indigenous women who you represent, Melania, both with the national, the process of the platform, but also broader, if you feel that this has helped fostering real and effective participation in climate governance for indigenous peoples in Peru. Thank you, Melania.
Bien, bueno, yo voy a hablar en castellano, pero va a haber traducción.
Okay, I will speak in Spanish, but there will be an interpretation.
Bien, yo quisiera decir, bueno, primeramente saludar a cada uno de ustedes que se encuentran presentes aquí en la mesa, IWGIA, también por promover este espacio de reflexión, también los representantes del Estado como de Perú y Canadá también, que puedan estar juntamente con nosotros en esta mesa.
Okay, first of all, I would like to say hello to all of you, and thanks to all the representatives here, and also IWGIA, for creating this space for reflection, and also the state representatives that are here present today.
Muchos de los avances en materia de cambio climático que se dan en nuestro país es gracias también a la exigencia de los pueblos indígenas y la lucha de las mujeres indígenas.
And a lot of steps that have been taken in climate change action are due to the hard work of indigenous peoples and also indigenous women.
Existe una ley marco de cambio climático en el Perú, pero que no fue consultado, porque en el Perú no se consulta. Y a partir de eso sale la reglamentación de la ley marco de cambio climático, que eso por exigencia también de los pueblos indígenas y mujeres indígenas fue consultado.
There's a law in Peru, the UNFCCC, and in Peru there was no consultation, and it was only due to the indigenous peoples that there was in the end a consultation about this law.
Y justamente en este reglamento impulsamos que esté la plataforma climática indígena, o sea, en la norma, ¿no? Como parte de una institucionalidad indígena, porque es parte también, o sea, donde estamos conversando, gobierno y pueblos indígenas.
It was also through the impulse from indigenous peoples that there has been established a platform from indigenous peoples.
Lo que pasa es que, como dice Milagros, bueno, hemos vivido el momento de la pandemia y nosotras no hemos paralizado, a pesar que no teníamos manejo del internet, del Zoom, de las plataformas, hemos continuado trabajando el plan de esta plataforma, también hemos seguido trabajando el reglamento de esta plataforma.
And as Milagros already mentioned, the pandemic paralyzed a lot of things, but they did not paralyze us because we had no access to internet, we didn't have any knowledge about the platforms, but we kept going and we kept working also on the platform and also the regulations for this platform.
Hasta el momento tenemos el plan, ¿no? El plan de trabajo de esta plataforma, pero sin embargo aún falta la asignación de un presupuesto público, sino simplemente será un monumento.
Until now, we only have a plan for this platform, but we still have to establish public funds. But without these funds, this platform would only be a monument.
Asimismo, hemos construido el reglamento de la plataforma, donde está también el MINAN, está el Ministerio de Cultura y están los pueblos indígenas. Sentimos que esa es la institucionalidad, ¿no?, dentro del aparato, como se dice, del Ministerio del Ambiente. pero aún falta una resolución de aprobación de este reglamento por el Ministerio del Ambiente, que es lo que estamos trabajando ahora.
Okay, so we have a regulation for this platform, and in this platform, the Ministry for Environment, for Culture, and also the Indigenous Peoples come together. So it can be said that it's in kind of like institutionalization of these parts within the Ministry of Environment, but we still need a resolution from the Ministry for Environment.
Sabemos, bueno, ya Milagro sabe que el asesor jurídicos han dicho que no es posible, por ejemplo, una resolución, ¿no? A pesar de que está en el reglamento la plataforma climática, porque también tenemos funcionarios muy coloniales y aparte que falta voluntad política, ¿no? Entonces, es lo que venimos exigiendo y nos han dado, ya no tenemos un documento donde dice que no es posible. Y entonces nosotras hemos quedado como organización indígena y a propuesta de nosotras como ONAMIAP, Organización de Mujeres, vamos a construir esa resolución con los marcos normativos internacionales y bueno, la nacional, que está el reglamento, entre otras, para que pueda ser discutido y podamos tener de esta manera un real reconocimiento también, si no es como que no existiéramos también.
Okay, just as Milagros should know, a lot of legal advisors told us that their resolution won't be possible because there are also colonial structures which tell us that it won't be possible, and they basically don't want to help us. So we as ONAMIAP want to construct a regulation to discuss these regulations and to be recognized, because without this regulation, it is as if we won't be existing.
Bien, lo dejamos ahí. En la segunda ronda seguimos conversando. Así que, bueno, para no tener muchos minutos.
Exactly, yeah. Thank you very much. Sorry, go.
This is all I wanted to say, and in the second round you will be able to ask questions.
Great, thank you very much, and thanks, Monica. Yeah, so yes, we'll come back indeed to the experience from Latin America and Peru, but for now let's move on. Let's turn towards the Arctic region. Lisa, perhaps you could share how Indigenous peoples in the Arctic feel recognized in climate governance, and maybe also tell us a bit about or reflect a bit on the significance of your organization, the Inuit Circumpolar Council, having obtained IPCC observer status as the first indigenous organization in the world. I also know your organization is involved in processes around co-production of knowledge and protocols, but feel free to share what you want to share, and again, we'll also come back in the second round to the panel later.
Nakormek ilon nasi. Thank you, Stefan, and thank you, everyone. I'm very glad to be made to feel welcome here, and to share a little bit about the work that we do at Inuit Circumpolar Council. And so Inuit Circumpolar Council was founded in the 1970s to act as the voice for Inuit in work at international forums. So we work with one voice, even though we live in 4 different political realities. As you may know, we live in 4 different countries in the Circumpolar region. And so Inuit Circumpolar Council represents the Inuit living in Russia, in Alaska, in Canada, and in Greenland. As you know, Greenland is also part of Denmark. As a representative and acting as one voice, we are permanent participants to the Arctic Council, which is a very important international institution of 7 different states where Indigenous people have permanent status, permanent participant status, and more recently we became observers to IPCC. And also recently, we have gained provisional consultative status at the International Maritime Organization, which regulates maritime industry. So we have a lot of interesting work that we're doing, but you know, it takes many years to develop those types of working relationships, and a lot of dedicated leaders to do that kind of work. So we bring our knowledge, our values, and we ensure that our right to self-determination and governance are brought to international fora. And so I'll speak of a couple of examples of the work that we're doing. In one area, we've been talking a lot about Indigenous knowledge. In my questioning mind, I've wondered, well, how do we define Indigenous knowledge? So I think it's really important to have a starting point. First of all, we recognize that the knowledge of Indigenous people is not stagnant. It's not stuck out in old ice somewhere. It's always renewing itself as well. And it's a system that is based on centuries and generations of observations and experiences and innovations. So it is a special system of knowledge as well. So that's an important first point that I like to make when we speak of our knowledge. And so that's also why very recently we came up with the Inuit protocols for equitable and ethical engagement. We just launched our document, which is about 36 pages, that also tells you about 8 certain protocols that one can take when doing projects on research, in Arctic research, in relationships with the Inuit. So it sets out how best to engage in the ethical and equitable engagement with Indigenous knowledge, or Inuit knowledge, that I like to say. So another example of how we are involved in Arctic work is in our engagement in the IPCC. Like Stefan said earlier, our chair, Daly, and Joanna from ICC Canada, our support person on climate change, have been quite involved in the IPCC. So we accomplished a few things, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about them. So we have been an active contributor to the 6th assessment cycle by being an active reviewer, a contributing author, and more recently, as mentioned, an official observer. So back in February 2020, ICC became the first and presently the only Indigenous Peoples organization to have observer status. And so I think this is how we were able to push our involvement within the IPCC sessions. So we contributed to Polar Region Cross Chapter in Working Group 2's report on impacts, adaptability, and vulnerability, emphasizing Inuit leadership in transformative adaptation and climate resilience. I'd like to cite some other contributions we've made, which are joint briefings with the IWGIA and others, including the briefing on Indigenous recognition in the IPCC reports. And recently, a new paradigm of climate partnership with Indigenous peoples, an analysis of the recognition of Indigenous peoples in the IPCC report on mitigation. That's a very long title. And so there's also a chapter that we've contributed on Indigenous knowledge systems in the IPCC process, and that's in the book, A Critical Assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That's set to be released in the fall. There's a lot more to say, but I'd like to just say that key messages focus on our self-determination, on the co-production of knowledge, on ethical and equitable engagement, and that is often in the form of partnerships that require often long years of experience and multilateral processes, but that emphasize Inuit leadership in our involvement in climate action. Nakormik, thank you.
Thanks so much, Lisa. So many interesting initiatives and that your organization is involved in also, so as a bit as first movers in these areas. So thanks so much for sharing, and we'll come back to you again. Emily, last but not the least, you're from representing the government of Canada, and we also know that Canada in some ways stand out in terms of how the engagement processes with Indigenous peoples are being conducted, and so please share your some kind of key key things that you want to share in that regard, and perhaps also briefly reflect on Canada's engagement in the international platform, the LCIP platform here at the UNFCCC. Thanks.
Thank you, Stefan. And yes, let me start by joining my fellow panelists in thanking the organizers for this event and creating this space, and for the invitation that you extended to me. I'm happy to be here to share some of the Government of Canada's experience on the Indigenous representation in climate governance. As a party representative, let me maybe use Decision 1, CP1, as a starting point, the decision that adopted the Paris Agreement and the Paris Agreement itself, just as a reminder for everyone here of some of the language around the promotion and consideration of the rights of Indigenous peoples and the role of Indigenous peoples in addressing climate change. And the reason that I'm bringing up this language that we probably are all familiar with is just to highlight that these references really emphasize Indigenous rights and agency. So while Indigenous peoples are uniquely and disproportionately affected by the adverse impacts of climate change, the importance of the contributions of Indigenous peoples is not only a question of so-called vulnerability. And I'm mentioning this now because these are sort of themes that I will highlight in my brief remarks for this first round. So that's also one of the reasons that Canada is a strong supporter of and was proud to, be a strong advocate for the creation of the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform, was one of the initial members of the Facilitative Working Group, which is really unique across the UN system in terms of recognizing in its own way the rights and the agency of Indigenous peoples, because the membership and decision-making power is shared equally between representatives of states and Indigenous peoples. Quickly, just to maybe respond to something that Gideon mentioned about COP27 or participation of Indigenous peoples and COPs in general. Canada is one delegation that does include representatives of national Indigenous organizations on our delegation, but also to reflect maybe on what Lisa mentioned as well, we are also very understanding and respectful of the choice of some Indigenous representatives living in Canada to represent themselves on an observer badge for the symbolism of that, and that doesn't preclude those representatives from participating in meetings and discussions with the delegation throughout as well. So to bring it back to Canada specifically, the starting point in Canada is the recognition that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples living in Canada, as well as Indigenous peoples around the world, are on the front lines of climate change. In Canada, we also are unwaveringly committed to advance reconciliation and implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And actually just almost a year ago, on June 21st, 2021, Canadian legislation to implement the UN Declaration entered into force. Back in 2016, following the release of the Pan-Canadian Framework on Climate Change and Clean Growth, as part of the Government of Canada's commitment to implement the Paris Agreement, the Government of Canada and leaders from the Assembly of First Nations, the Inuit Tapirit Kanatami, and the Métis National Council established 3 distinctions-based senior bilateral tables on clean growth and climate change, also a long name. These tables have been instrumental in addressing climate change domestically, and ensuring that Canada's strengthened climate plan and Canada's enhanced nationally determined contributions responded to Indigenous climate priorities and positioned Indigenous climate leadership within our climate governance. A few other places that those 3 distinctions-based tables contributed to is, like I mentioned, our enhanced NDC that we submitted prior to COP26, and which includes annexes, I should mention, outlining in their own voices First Nations, Inuit, and Métis climate priorities and actions, but also our recently published 2030 emissions reduction plan, which is Canada's roadmap to achieve our 2030 target, and as well ongoing work to prepare Canada's first national adaptation strategy. So perhaps I will just end there for now, and look forward to the next round.
Thanks so much. And I'm also conscious of time. I think, but now we have gone through the full panel, and we have got input and reflections both from Indigenous representatives and from state parties. Indeed, there are some regions obviously not represented here in the panel, but I think we've kind of got a broad sense of some of the progress and developments that are being seen in recent years, both initiatives taken by Indigenous peoples, but also by governance, and indeed also together to promote Indigenous voice and Indigenous peoples in global climate governance. And that is also in accordance with some of the recommendations from the IPCC. But now I think it's time to move on to then reflect a bit on the gaps and the shortcomings. Like if we move back to the 2 briefing papers we've developed, where we also identify some shortcomings and gaps by the IPCC, and again, these were produced by Indigenous authors that see that despite the progress, the IPCC still on some issues miss the point, and perhaps that mirrors well how, despite the progress we see in different regions and countries, indigenous peoples are still not fully recognized, and the knowledge systems and the rights are not fully recognized. And I'm conscious, Milagros, you have to leave in 10 minutes. But I think it's really important that you also hear, and Emily and other state reps in the room here, online, hear some of these gaps identified, but also the recommendations that were made in that regard, especially to state parties. And so, turning towards Rosario again, if you want to take the floor and first talk about these gaps, and then and then summarize the recommendations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, absolutely. We recognize the progress, but we also identify a lot of gaps. And we think that these gaps are mainly because, well, regarding especially the IPCC, is because the inclusion of indigenous peoples authors is still inadequate. In fact, there is no official information on the self-determination of indigenous authors, and they represent the countries, not their peoples. The low participation of indigenous authors is reflected in a weak approach to their collective rights. For example, mentions of free, prior, and informed consent are very scarce, although the Working Group 2 recognizes its importance. There is some mentions to veto power, but in a context where indigenous peoples are integrated into civil society. It should also be noted that indigenous peoples are treated mainly as a homogeneous group, making generalizations that do not reflect the diversity of identities, territories, and knowledge systems. Furthermore, in terms of indigenous territories, both Working Group 2 and 3 refer predominantly to forest, leaving aside other ecosystems that are relevant to indigenous peoples and that also contribute significantly to mitigation. Although the relevance of indigenous knowledge is recognized even by the Working Group 1, the reports speak more of integrating indigenous knowledge into non-indigenous science than of equal collaboration or partnerships. This top-down approach reduces indigenous knowledge systems to local and specific practices that align with hegemonic environmental agendas. Other components of these systems, such as governance, values, and worldviews relevant to responding to climate change, are largely omitted. We agree that indigenous peoples are one of the most vulnerable groups in the face of climate change, but we also believe this vulnerability needs to be analyzed more critically. For example, an in-depth analysis of non-material losses and damages from both climate change and climate measures is mainly absent. And finally, something that really needs to be taken into consideration in order to promote greater coherence around the recognition of indigenous peoples is the lack of consistency in the treatment given to indigenous peoples across different working groups. So we believe that both progress and gaps reflect the place of indigenous peoples in state climate governance. The IPCC reports note that the contribution of indigenous peoples can make are determined mainly by the level of engagement that the state promote. With this in mind, we have developed a series of recommendations in both briefing notes, which I would like to summarize for you. First, it is crucial that all climate actions must be based on the right of indigenous peoples, including the right to self-determination. Free, prior, and informed consent is a precondition for any activity implemented in indigenous peoples' territories or in other ways affecting indigenous peoples. Climate action must go hand in hand with social justice processes that address the structural causes that have led to the marginalization of indigenous peoples, the exploitation of their territories, and the climate crisis. Also, it is highly necessary that the state create concrete and permanent participatory mechanisms for indigenous peoples to influence the design and planning of climate policies, but also the monitoring, verification, and reporting of their progress. Regarding knowledge, the state must secure meaningful and respectful recognition of indigenous peoples' knowledge systems before just saying that indigenous knowledge will be considered in climate policy. For this, climate research must be based on meaningful, ethical, and equitable processes of collaboration and co-production of knowledge in all levels. Also crucial that indigenous peoples have direct access to climate finance in order to design strategies that truly respond to their needs. And finally, considering that the space for participation remains restricted under the UNFCCC for indigenous peoples, we suggest that as long as it is consistent with the desires of indigenous peoples organizations, states must effectively engage them in multilateral and intergovernmental processes, including IPCC processes. And this requires ongoing capacity building, and not only for indigenous peoples, but especially for officials and delegates. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosario, for summarizing these quite significant findings and also recommendations, which clearly shows that there's still a gap in terms of basically the messages that indigenous peoples promote, and also the way that they ought to be recognized in these processes. And now I'd love to hear from the indigenous speakers in the panel first, but Milagros, you have to leave. So before you leave, perhaps maybe I'll just give you the word first, and then hear if you feel that the processes that you're involved in Peru, is it sufficient? Is it, and also not only Peru, but internationally, do we listen enough? Do we engage enough indigenous peoples? Do they have, is real and effective engagement really fostered under the current structures of the UNFCCC and states?
Thank you, and thank you for giving me the floor again. And I'm sorry I have to leave, but unfortunately our delegation is pretty small, so I have to run around. So thanks for that. I think that nothing that we will do will be enough, and I think that that gives us the goal to try to do whatever is necessary to promote that the participation of indigenous peoples is effective and efficient in this process, not only at the international level, but also at the national level. So we need to engage together, not to give a voice to indigenous peoples. It's not that we as governments or as civil society bring the voice, it's them that they have to be given a voice. We are never going to replace what they can say or what they need to say, because this is from them, from their traditional knowledge, from the things that they are saying. And obviously this needs to be reflected also in science, in the work that has to be done both at the national and international levels. I would like also to highlight that, as we have seen that Peru has made a submission related to that, there is now a specific, through the IPCC reports related to both to adaptation and mitigation that we have seen during the last years, there is no specific, the information is more global. And actually, the information is more related to the north. And there's no specific information related to the south. And obviously, that is a big gap that we have. Because if we don't have information, it is going to be very difficult for developing countries to address and to address specifically issues related to adaptation. And I think that is something that obviously will reflect, as has been mentioned, in the lack of information, for example, of indigenous peoples in these reports. Because if we don't even have regional zoom in of information of the South, that is one of the main problems we're having. So we have to invest not only through governments, but also through other organizations and cooperation that can support the science that we need to adapt to climate change. Because especially as it's obvious, Indigenous peoples are the most vulnerable. Indigenous women are more vulnerable to climate change, but we need more information in order to understand and draft the necessary policies, necessary programs at the national and subnational levels that can address this process. And I think that also, I just would like to highlight that it was mentioned that there's much information related to forests, and that's true because forest is something that we have that has been addressed at more globally, but we need more information. Peru has obviously different indigenous peoples. It was mentioned that they have been treated as an homogeneous group, and obviously this is not the way in which we see and the policies we address. And this, for example, this is why we have 7 indigenous peoples organizations that have been represented at the national level and that try to reflect the differences between these groups. But obviously, the effects of climate change are different and have to be differentiated even at the subnational levels, at the local level. So that is part of the process. And I think that what we need to do is try to engage and try to reflect this process and how to address definitely the science as well, because that's the first step that we need. And obviously, when I say science, it's also bringing in traditional knowledge as part of this process. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Milagros, and very, I think, a very honest as well contribution from your side, and I thank you very much for that. Also, recognition that nothing will ever be enough, but still, you know, we also have to see at the progress and of those governments who actually intend to make change. And I also know within governments there are individuals and there are ministries, and you know, it's also about promoting cross-ministerial understanding of certain knowledges, especially when it comes to human rights. And I think the platform in Peru is a good opportunity for some ministries to help promote an understanding to other ministries where there is certain decisions taken that affects indigenous peoples in climate action. I think that goes that's not only the case for Peru, but for governments around the world. So thank you very much for those insights, and feel free to leave when you can't stay any longer. And so I think we'll go back to the 3 indigenous panelists we have here to again hear on, you know, if we realize that the IPCC as a global leading so-called scientific body are missing the point on certain issues with regards to indigenous peoples, how so much more is that the case in climate governance, both at global and national and local level? So perhaps we can start with you again, Gideon, to reflect on this, and then also come back on and share the case of the knowledge holder platform that you are promoting in Tanzania. Thank you.
Thank you so much again, Stefan, for this giving me a floor. Let me just give a brief genesis of the Indigenous People Knowledge Holders Platform in Tanzania, just briefly, that we have established in 2021. We have just established the Knowledge Holders Platform of Indigenous People in Tanzania, and it was officially launched by the Vice President Office, who also mandated on climate and environment issues. And the key objective of this Knowledge Holders Platform is to facilitate dialogue among the knowledge holders, indigenous people, and the decision makers, to share their knowledge and the best practices on climate change related issues. But also the objective is also to share experiences, challenges, and lessons learned on climate change issues. The other objective is to package this information and disseminate widely to the public to inform decision-making processes. But also, this platform comprises of the following: knowledge holders from the communities, traditional leaders, opinion leaders, youth, both men and women, as well as women, those who are the specific knowledge holders. And this actually platform met twice a year, and I here really to appreciate the support from IGIA because they have been really supporting this platform to make sure it's really functioning. With regards to the gaps from what we have seen from the IPCC reports, among what Rosaria already mentioned, is about the forest. The report put emphasis on the forest of indigenous people and left out the savanna ecosystem, which is also an important area to give focus on it. So this is a gaps that I have seen among the rest that Rosario already mentioned. On recognition of indigenous people issues and gaps, especially from the national, regional, and global level, we have seen non-recognition of indigenous people rights on their critical role on biodiversity, ecosystem conservation. That is the lack of recognitions. There is also lack of indigenous people inclusion on climate policies and decision-making processes, especially during the design and the implementation of the climate policies. And now we are seeing the importance of free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC. That's really of paramount. And when you look at the NDCs, several NDCs have not really captured references on indigenous people. This is, I can make reference to Tanzania NDCs. You cannot find anything related to indigenous people issues. Only on pastoralism. So these are the few issues I would like Stefan to mention, but also issues related to climate intervention programs in Tanzania become another threat. Instead of addressing adaptation needs to indigenous people, sometimes it's really threatening the rights of indigenous people over their lands. So we are facing a lot of challenges as we speak. A lot of indigenous people facing evictions from their ancestral land as a result of the government claiming that they want to conserve the forest. So for us, it becomes really a threat. So we need to look at this intervention and to follow up to ensure that the rights of indigenous people are respected. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gideon, and also thanks for sharing how indigenous pastoralists and hunter-gatherers today are at risk of being evicted from the lands in the name of climate action and conservation. I would encourage you all to go in and read about the case in Ngorongoro. And I know you're very, very much involved in this, and you have also raised this issue with the new Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Climate Change at this conference. So please, all of you, go in and sign the petitions and support support the action being taken to secure the rights in this case and other cases. So thanks for that, Gideon. Moving on to Melania, could you as well, the same question, kind of reflect on the current gaps and shortcomings that you feel that indigenous peoples and indigenous women, not only in Peru but globally, face in climate governance?
Bien, sé que ningún derecho es gratuito. Todo se consigue con las luchas, ¿no? Y en esa defensa.
I know that there's no right that is free and that you have to fight for it and you have to defend your rights.
Sabemos como mujeres indígenas nuestras luchas es al interno también de las propias organizaciones indígenas por el tema del machismo.
And as indigenous women, we also know that we have to fight within the same organizations because there are also machist structures. Yeah, it's a machist society, and these structures are also reflected within the organizations.
Y asimismo también hacia afuera por el racismo, el colonialismo, el extractivismo de nuestros conocimientos, de nuestra ciencia y tecnología, pero también de la madre tierra.
But there are also fights to the exterior because we have to fight against racism, colonialism, and also extractivism. And we suffer from extractivism from our knowledge, our technologies, and also from the planet Earth.
Actualmente, como hemos visto, en el Perú contamos con la Plataforma Climática Indígena Nacional, reconocida por un reglamento de la Ley Marco de Cambio Climático.
Right now in Peru, we have a national Indigenous Peoples climate platform that is only recognized within Peru.
Pero necesitamos que se fortalezca, ¿no? Que se fortalezca a nivel nacional, a nivel regional o subnacional, que le dicen, a nivel local.
But we need this platform to be strengthened on international, regional, and global level.
O sea, en los distintos niveles de gobierno. ¿Sí?
So on the different levels of governance.
Y asimismo con asignación de presupuesto, porque si esta plataforma no tiene un presupuesto, no va a funcionar.
And the same thing is for the funding, because without the funding we won't have any chance to strengthen this platform.
Y creo yo, en el marco de la crisis climática, es importante también, nosotras decimos, es importante, sobre todo en el pensamiento de, en este caso, UNFCCC, del continente, no sé, pues, americano, que es hoy, necesitamos o venimos promoviendo también el derecho de la madre tierra, de la madre naturaleza, como un ser vivo, porque para nosotras tiene vida, quizás en otros continentes no, pero en nuestro continente la madre tiene vida.
And also in the context of climate change, we have to always think of the continent IWGIA, which is the American continent, and we have to fight for the rights and to see that the planet is a living being and it has life. And it may be that in other continents there is not this perception, but in our continent, the planet Earth is a living being.
Las mujeres indígenas no solo defendemos la vida de las personas, defendemos a las vidas, o sea, las vidas, la madre tierra, la madre naturaleza. Y esto para las futuras generaciones, para que tengan una vida digna.
We as indigenous women not only defend the life of persons, but we defend all lives. So this means we defend the nature, and we do this in order to be able that the future generations can live in dignity.
Sin la madre tierra no es posible la vida de las personas, no es posible la vida de las futuras generaciones.
Without Mother Earth, there will be no life in the future generations.
Otra cosa, como mujeres indígenas, no solo pensamos en el bosque, porque cuando se habla de cambio climático, solo se piensa en el bosque. Nosotras pensamos en el territorio integral, o sea, pensamos en todo el cuerpo, el mar, las montañas, los glaciales, los ríos, no, todo están interconectados.
And we as indigenous women not only talk about the rainforests, but we also have in mind all the other ecosystems that have to be protected. For example, the sea, the mountains, glaciers, and also the rivers.
Bueno, nuestra lucha continúa. En realidad sabemos que hay funcionarios que entienden, pero hay funcionarios que no entienden. Hay jurídicos, abogados, que son totalmente monoculturales y muy coloniales, y entonces tienes que estar lidiando día a día con ellos también. Y eso es nuestra lucha en realidad, tratando de que entiendan cuando deberían de, como se dice, tomar un poquito de conciencia.
So FIND continues. And another point is that there are a lot of lawyers and a lot of people that still have a colonial monocultural mindset. So this is our daily fight, and we have to fight against them, although they should be the ones to have a bit more consciousness.
Bien, bueno, ahí la dejamos. Muchas gracias.
This was all. Thank you a lot.
Thanks so much, Melania. And indeed, what you present there, maybe reflecting the Americas, but I think also broader how many indigenous peoples in other sociocultural regions think and feel about the planet, the state of the planet, and what is being done and what should be done and not being done in that regard. Lisa, moving on to you. What are your reflections, both on what has been said here, but also on, again, the recommendations, the findings and recommendations from our briefing papers?
Yes, thank you to Gideon and Melania for their viewpoints, and which we share too a lot. And what I would like to say is, over the last decade or so, there has been an increasing focus on the Arctic, especially due to, the consequences of climate change. There's international politics. There's more and more resource development in the Arctic. And with that, there is also more and more research in the Arctic. There's also tourism. So there are more and more things that are happening that are impacting on us. And sometimes it's forgotten that there are people living in the Arctic. So in this context, we've been seeing an increasing number of institutions and governments and others who are starting to recognize the importance of needing guidelines and protocols. So I think the creation of the Inuit protocols is a very important step. And how do you learn about the protocols? How do you learn how to relate with Inuit or even other indigenous peoples? I think it's by reading these kinds of documents and having the intention of learning about these documents. In Canada, the Canadian Inuit, we also have a national Inuit strategy on research. And so we encourage scientists or others, policymakers, to read these documents, to really have the intention of learning from us about how we wish to be related to. So there's also webinars on YouTube that you can take advantage of. There have been training sessions on indigenous knowledge and how to work with indigenous people to build capacity, to build your own capacity, to build our capacity, this particular one that I'd like to mention to you was created by the Facilitative Working Group representatives under the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform. So there is a webinar there that you can actually take advantage of. Another, and lastly, an important aspect, a gap that I would like to mention is the negative implications of categorizing developed and developing countries in the context of, recognizing the need to support indigenous peoples due to the impacts of climate change and financing related to indigenous peoples and communities and lands. This distinction of developed and developing countries leads to exclusion of Arctic communities. So we are in the front lines of climate change, and we experience similar social and economic and non-economic inequities due to the impacts of climate change. So that is something I believe should be addressed, is to ensure that there is really an equitable process for all peoples who are negatively impacted by climate change. Nakormik?
Thanks so much. And just a service announcement, if you go to YouTube and just Google LCIPP webinar, you'll find the 4 webinars that Lisa has mentioned. They were co-hosted by Daily Sambo under the first work plan of the Indigenous Peoples platform, and indeed are, like, I believe all state parties involved in the UNFCCC should listen into those 4 and listen to the indigenous voices from around the world to really get a full understanding of what is meant by equitable engagement and recognition of knowledge. So thanks for that, Lisa, and also to mention that the LCIPP came up with a mapping of existing finance and recommendations in that regard. And again, the LCIPP is a body where there are 7 indigenous representatives, members, and 7 state parties, and they came up with a number of recommendations in that regard. And one of the recommendations is that indeed climate finance should be available not only for indigenous peoples in the global south, but for all 7 socio-cultural regions of the world. Great. So time is running out, and we also want to have time for a couple of questions if possible. But I think it's also very important to hear Emily's reflections on what has been said. And again, I know you have to talk, being as a government official. But again, just as with Milagros, who came with good reflections, it would also be good to hear from you your thoughts on this. And what can be done not only by the government of Canada, but also by other governments around the world.
Thank you. And yes, I will try to stick to a few reflections I have on what my previous panelists have mentioned. So the first round, we talked about some of the good news stories. And I do think that spaces like, for example, the bilateral tables that I mentioned in Canada, or the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform and its Facilitative Working Group internationally, are steps in the right direction. But to build on what Melania mentioned, we are aware that systemic barriers persist in Canada and internationally and in the UNFCCC. Historically, but also currently, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis in Canada all experienced and continue to experience the effects of colonialism. And this is similar in other places in the world as well. So creating spaces for dialogue can help build mutual trust and understanding and help address challenges, but creating the space isn't enough. So one of the reflections that I will summarize quickly is just an approach that Canada has been taking, which is seeking to apply some key principles of engagement for, full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples. And these are principles that I will not pretend that Canada has perfected yet. But just as a sort of step towards improvement, these key principles of ethical and effective engagement include being rights-based, and I spoke about this a little bit, but using the UN Declaration, including free, prior, and informed consent as a basis of engagement. To respond, or to build on Milagros's point as well, in Canada we say distinctions-based, but this is the idea of avoiding pan-indigenization of realities, of issues, of concerns, of preoccupations, of challenges to address. Engagement should be meaningful and responsive, and sometimes these terms are used a lot without really being understood. But what some of the practical things that we do to try to live up to that idea is, not just engaging one time, engaging throughout a process of developing a policy, of developing climate actions from the beginning, throughout, and also at the end to reflect on the outcomes of how that policy shaped up, which comments were taken up, which ones weren't, and why. Being transparent and predictable. This one is hard, especially in the international space. Sometimes, transparency of decisions and why they are taken is important. Having the space for participation, so Indigenous peoples can see for themselves how decisions are being made. But predictable, always a challenge. Timelines, but trying to engage early and provide information so that everyone at the table at a discussion can be prepared to discuss the issues. Another one that's sometimes a challenge in this line of work is being coordinated. You mentioned it, across ministries, but I would say for this room and in this context also, having the representatives like me working internationally be coordinated with the government officials working nationally to implement. That's not always done as well as it should, and we need to work better to do that better. And finally, inclusivity and accessibility. So not always, just making sure that the marginalized voices, so Indigenous peoples, Indigenous women, Indigenous youth are included. And in terms of accessibility, some very practical things. Thank you to the translators. But also making the space welcoming for different cultures and ways of interacting, providing resources and capacities to be able to, an event is happening, but people need to get there, is one very straightforward way of mentioning it. I will stop there. I don't know if we still have time for questions, but I would love to. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Unfortunately, I think we're running out of time, and there won't be time for questions. And I also know there have been questions asked at the platform, the online platform. So apologies for this, but maybe the conversation can continue either here for a couple of minutes after the event or outside. I'm sure the panelists will be available to continue the dialogue. But I just want to summarize again some of what I'm taking from this. I've taken from this event that there's a lot being done in many countries and many regions around the world to try to really promote Indigenous peoples' recognition and the knowledge and rights in climate governance. But much more needs to be done, and especially when it comes to the bigger structural issues, they still lack the inspiration and reflection of Indigenous knowledge, and so I think that's a very key message from taking from this event today that we hope will be heard in there where decisions are being made these days. So again, thank you very much to the panel of speakers. To Rosario, Gideon, Milagros who has left, Melania, Lisa, and Emily. Very interesting to hear you all, and thanks also for co-organizing and for those who have been involved in our publications. And thanks for the interpreters. Just a very final thing. I just want to say that each year IWGIA publishes this book, which is the Indigenous World. It has a chapter on many countries, and then also in the second half, a chapter on each of the multilateral processes, including a chapter on the UNFCCC. And it's all about, Indigenous people's rights and recognition in these countries and in these processes. So I have a few copies here for those who are interested, and for the rest, you can also download the PDF. Thank you very much for today. Thanks.